The question is, what comes next? So where does that leave us today? Indochinese architecture is at a crossroads. It's a reminder of the past, but it's also part of the urban fabric of modern Vietnam and other former colonies. Hey everyone, I'm Mark, and welcome to Why Buildings Matter, a shortcast series brought to you by the Architecture Hypothesis podcast. This series is designed to be short and digestible, something you can listen to during your free time, at the end of the day, on a train, a bus, or whenever you feel like diving into thought-provoking discussions about architecture. Each episode will explore a key architectural concept and discuss a fascinating book on architectural theory or criticism. So, let's get started. Hey everyone, welcome back to Why Buildings Matter. If this is your first time tuning in, this is a show where we explore the intersection of architecture, history, and culture. And today, in episode 3, we're diving into a topic that's as complex as it is fascinating: Indochinese architecture, its colonial origins, its evolution, and its fate in the post-colonial world. Now, architecture isn't just about buildings. It's about the people who design them, the cultures they reflect, and the societies they shape. And Indochinese architecture is a perfect example of this. To really understand it, we have to start at the beginning. So let's rewind a bit and take a look at how colonial architecture took root in Vietnam and what made it unique. Picture Vietnam in the early 20th century. The country was under French colonial rule, and like many other colonies around the world, its cities were being transformed. At first, the French built government offices, schools, churches, and private villas in a strict neoclassical style, the same kind of grand, symmetrical architecture you'd find in Paris. These buildings, with their decorative columns and intricate facades, were meant to showcase French power and civilization. But there was a problem. Vietnam is hot, it's humid, and these European-style buildings, designed for a much cooler climate, didn't work well in their new environment. They were stuffy, poorly ventilated, and uncomfortable. The tropical heat and monsoon rains quickly took a toll on their materials and construction, so the French had to rethink their approach. This is where Ernest Hébrard comes in. Hébrard was a French architect and urban planner who arrived in Indochina in the early 1920s. He realized that simply transplanting French architecture into Vietnam wasn't going to cut it. Instead, he developed a new style, one that blended European construction techniques with local Southeast Asian architectural traditions. This style became known as Indochinese architecture, and here's what made it special: multi-layered tiled roofs. These were inspired by traditional Vietnamese structures, and they helped keep buildings cool and well ventilated, deep verandas and overhanging eaves. These provided shade and protected buildings from heavy monsoon rains. Ornamental details influenced by Asian art, from intricate wood carvings to lacquered doors, many elements of Indochinese architecture reflected traditional Vietnamese aesthetics. Some of the most famous examples of this style include the Indochina University, now part of Vietnam National University, and the Blanchard de la Brosse Museum, now the Museum of Vietnamese History in Ho Chi Minh City. But here's the thing: colonial architecture wasn't just something imposed by the French government. It was also shaped by local elites who played a key role in adopting and spreading these architectural innovations. So who exactly were these people? To answer that, we need to talk about a unique social class that existed in colonial Vietnam and in many other parts of the world under European rule. They were called the compradors. Now, if you're not familiar with the term, the word comprador actually comes from Portuguese, and it means buyer. Originally, it was used to describe merchants who acted as middlemen between local markets and European traders. But in French Indochina, the comprador class was more than just a group of businessmen. They were wealthy Vietnamese, Chinese, and other Asian entrepreneurs who played a crucial role in the colonial economy. They ran businesses, owned plantations, and controlled trade networks. And as they grew richer, they built homes, offices, and public spaces that blended European and Asian influences. If you've ever watched the film Indochine by Régis Warnier, you might remember the mansion where Eliane de Vries, the wealthy plantation owner played by Catherine Deneuve, lived. The architecture of her home is a perfect example of this fusion. French elegance mixed with local Vietnamese elements. This wasn't just a matter of taste. It was about status. For the comprador class, architecture was a way of showing power and modernity. Their buildings borrowed the grandeur of European design while still incorporating Asian cultural elements. Things like courtyards, decorative motifs, and feng shui principles. And here's what's really interesting. While the French originally built colonial cities to be segregated, with clear divisions between European and native districts, the comprador class challenged these boundaries. Their grand mansions and office buildings blurred the lines between colonial authority and local entrepreneurship. In cities like Saigon, Singapore, and Penang, they created a new kind of architecture, one that wasn't entirely European, but also wasn't entirely Asian. And in doing so, they reshaped the urban landscape of colonial Indochina. But of course, no colonial empire lasts forever. So what happened to these buildings and to Indochinese architecture itself when Vietnam and other countries gained independence? When Vietnam became independent, it had to decide what to do with its colonial legacy, including its architecture. And this wasn't just a Vietnamese dilemma. Across Asia and Africa, newly independent nations struggled with the same question. Should they preserve colonial-era buildings, or should they erase them and start fresh? In some places, the answer was total demolition. In parts of Africa, for example, newly formed governments tore down colonial administrative buildings as a symbolic way of breaking with the past. But in Vietnam, the approach was different. Instead of destroying colonial buildings, the new government repurposed them. The Governor General's palace became the presidential palace. The Indochina University was transformed into Vietnam National University. Even colonial mansions were taken over and used for government offices or other state functions. As historian Frederick Cooper argues, decolonization wasn't a single moment in history. It was a long, complex process. The colonial past couldn't just be erased overnight, and in many ways, that's still true today. If you walk through Hanoi or Ho Chi Minh City, you'll see French villas and colonial-era public buildings standing side by side with modern skyscrapers. Some have been beautifully restored, while others are slowly disappearing. So here's the big question. As cities modernize, should they fight to preserve their colonial architecture? Or should they let it go and embrace a completely new identity? As we move into the 21st century, the question of what to do with colonial era architecture has become increasingly urgent. Across Asia, rapid urbanization and economic growth have led to an ongoing debate. Should these buildings be preserved as part of a nation's historical and cultural heritage? Or should they make way for modern development, representing progress and economic expansion? This debate is playing out in cities like Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh City, Jakarta, and Bangkok, where colonial-era buildings are disappearing at an alarming rate, often replaced by glass skyscrapers, shopping malls, and high-rise apartments. In Hanoi, for example, the French villas along Tran Hung Dao and Li Thuong Kiet streets are slowly being demolished to make space for new developments. Even historic landmarks like Hanoi Railway Station have faced demolition proposals, sparking fierce opposition from preservationists and architects. At the heart of this conflict is a fundamental question. What role should colonial architecture play in a country's post-colonial identity? For some, these buildings are painful reminders of colonial rule, symbols of foreign domination that have no place in an independent nation. For others, they are important pieces of history, telling the story of how cities developed and evolved over time. And there's also a very practical consideration: economics. In fast-growing cities, real estate is valuable, and colonial-era buildings are often located in prime urban locations. Developers argue that keeping old buildings limits economic growth. They take up space that could be used for more profitable high-rise developments. But on the other side of the argument, preservationists point out that historic architecture can also be a powerful economic asset. Just look at cities like Singapore, Penang, or Macau, where carefully preserved colonial districts have become major tourist attractions. One of the most successful examples of balancing preservation with modernity is Singapore. If you visit Singapore today, you'll see a city of futuristic skyscrapers, but you'll also find well-preserved heritage districts like Chinatown, Kampong Glam, and Little India. How did they do it? Instead of demolishing everything from the colonial era, the Singaporean government adopted a policy of selective conservation. Key historic buildings were restored and protected. Heritage districts were transformed into vibrant commercial and cultural hubs. Meanwhile, areas with less historical value were developed into modern business districts. The result? A dynamic balance between the past and the future, one that not only preserves history, but also fuels economic growth. Indonesia has taken a similar approach. In Jakarta, authorities have worked to revitalize the old colonial district of Kota Tua, turning it into a cultural and historical attraction. But in Vietnam, the situation remains uncertain. Some colonial-era buildings, like the Saigon Central Post Office or the Hanoi Opera House, have been well preserved, but many others are being lost to rapid urbanization. The question is, what comes next? So where does that leave us today? Indochinese architecture is at a crossroads. It's a reminder of the past, but it's also part of the urban fabric of modern Vietnam and other former colonies. The challenge now is figuring out how to balance preservation and progress. One possible approach is adaptive reuse, finding new purposes for old buildings instead of demolishing them. We've already seen this happen in places like Hanoi, where former French mansions have been transformed into boutique hotels, art galleries, or government offices. Another option is strengthening legal protections for historic architecture. Right now, many colonial buildings lack formal heritage status, making them vulnerable to demolition. Stronger regulations could help ensure that Vietnam's architectural history isn't erased in the name of modernization. Ultimately, the fate of Indochinese architecture will depend on the choices made today. Will these buildings continue to disappear, replaced by steel and glass towers? Or will they be preserved as an integral part of the country's rich and complex history? Perhaps the answer isn't black and white. As Bogaerts and Raben argue, post-colonial urban development isn't about choosing between the past and the future. It's about finding ways to make them coexist. So what do you think? Should colonial-era architecture be preserved as part of Vietnam's cultural identity? Or should cities be free to modernize and move on from the past? No matter where you stand on the issue, one thing is clear. Architecture isn't just about buildings. It's about history, identity, and the choices societies make about what to remember and what to forget. That wraps up today's episode of Why Buildings Matter. If you enjoyed this discussion, be sure to subscribe and share. And as always, keep looking at the world around you, because every building has a story to tell. If you enjoyed today's episode of Why Buildings Matter, consider supporting us by buying a coffee. Links to Ko-fi and PayPal are in the description. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss any upcoming episodes. Thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next episode of Why Buildings Matter.